July 14, 1847, 6:23 a.m. The auction platform in Charleston, South Carolina, stood in the center of Ryan's Mart, a building specifically designed for the sale of human beings. With high ceilings that amplified the auctioneer's voice and barred windows that prevented escape. On this particular morning, a man named Joseph Blake stood on the wooden platform while approximately 90 potential buyers examined him with the clinical detachment of people inspecting livestock. Joseph was 28 years old, stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighed 167 pounds, and his body was covered with raised, hardened lesions that had begun appearing on his skin 11 months earlier. The lesions looked like small stones embedded beneath the surface. Circular nodules ranging from the size of a pea to the size of a walnut, distributed across his back, shoulders, arms, and chest in a pattern that seemed random, but was actually spreading systematically from his spine outward. The auctioneer, Marcus Webb, 51 years old and 26 years in the slave trading business, had never seen anything quite like Joseph's condition, and neither had the assembled buyers, which meant Joseph was about to be sold for far less than a healthy man of his age and build would command. The bidding started at $200, approximately 1/6 of what a prime field hand typically sold for in Charleston in 1847. The low opening price reflected the buyer's calculation that Joseph's condition, whatever it was, would likely kill him within a year, possibly sooner, and would certainly prevent him from performing heavy labor during whatever time he had left. 3 buyers raised their hands: a plantation owner looking for disposable labor for marsh drainage work, a medical doctor interested in studying unusual diseases, and a mill operator who needed workers for a particularly dangerous cotton processing operation, where the average employee lasted only 18 months before injury or death made them useless. The bidding climbed slowly: $250, $300, $350, and stalled at $400 when the plantation owner dropped out. That left Dr. Richard Pemberton, 44 years old and operator of a private medical practice in Charleston, competing against the mill operator. Pemberton raised his final bid to $450, and the mill operator shook his head and withdrew. Joseph Blake was sold to Dr. Pemberton for a price that barely covered the cost of his food and housing over the past year. Pemberton purchased Joseph for a specific reason that had nothing to do with labor or sympathy. The doctor specialized in dermatological conditions, diseases and abnormalities of the skin, and had been searching for years for an unusual case that he could study, document, and present to the Medical Society of South Carolina to establish his reputation as a researcher. Joseph's condition appeared to be exactly what Pemberton needed: a progressive disease with visible symptoms that could be photographed and measured, affecting a patient who couldn't refuse treatment or examination, occurring in a body that Pemberton legally owned and could therefore study without ethical constraints. The doctor had no intention of curing Joseph. In fact, he needed Joseph to remain sick so that the disease's progression could be fully documented. What Pemberton didn't know was that Joseph Blake had already figured out what was causing the lesions, had developed a theory about how to treat them, and was planning to cure himself using methods that would cost Pemberton his research opportunity and destroy the doctor's plans for academic recognition. Joseph's condition had started in August 1846, while he was working on a rice plantation 40 miles north of Charleston. The first lesion appeared on his lower back, just above his left hip. A small, hard bump that felt like a pebble under the skin. Within 2 weeks, 3 more lesions had appeared. And within 6 weeks, he had developed 23 separate nodules distributed across his back and shoulders. The plantation overseer, a man named William Graves, who had no medical training but plenty of experience working enslaved people to death, decided that Joseph's condition was contagious and potentially dangerous to the other slaves. Graves isolated Joseph in a separate cabin, reduced his food rations to save money, and began looking for a buyer who would take a diseased slave off his hands. The isolation gave Joseph something that few enslaved people ever had: time alone to think, to observe his own body, and to experiment with potential treatments without interference or supervision. During his 11 months of isolation, Joseph noticed patterns in how the lesions developed and spread. New nodules appeared approximately every 12-15 days, always in areas where his skin had been exposed to prolonged pressure or friction: under his belt line, where his shirt rubbed against his shoulders, where he rested his arms when sitting. The lesions were painless initially, but became increasingly uncomfortable as they hardened, restricting movement and making it difficult to sleep on his back. Joseph also noticed that the lesions seemed to worsen during periods when his diet consisted primarily of corn and rice, and improved slightly during the brief times when he received vegetables or meat. This observation led him to develop a hypothesis. The condition was caused by a nutritional deficiency that affected how his body built and maintained skin tissue, and the mechanical stress of pressure and friction on malnourished skin triggered the formation of the hardened nodules. Joseph's hypothesis was remarkably close to what modern medicine would later identify as a form of calcinosis cutis, a condition where calcium deposits form in the skin, often triggered by a combination of nutritional deficiency, particularly vitamin D, and proper calcium metabolism, mechanical trauma, and other factors that weren't understood in 1847. But Joseph didn't need to understand the biochemical mechanisms to develop a treatment plan. He needed 3 things: better nutrition to provide his body with whatever nutrients it was missing, reduced friction and pressure on his skin to prevent new lesions from forming, and some method to break down or remove the existing calcium deposits. He had no access to the first 2 requirements while enslaved on the rice plantation, but being sold to Dr. Pemberton in Charleston created an unexpected opportunity. Pemberton transported Joseph to his Charleston residence on July 14th, arriving at 11:47 a.m. at a 3-story brick building that served as both the doctor's home and his medical practice. The building included examination rooms, a small laboratory, living quarters for Pemberton's family on the 2nd floor, and basement quarters where Pemberton housed the 6 enslaved people he owned, who served as household staff and medical subjects. Joseph was taken to the basement and given a small room, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and a single barred window at ground level that provided minimal light. Pemberton examined Joseph that afternoon, spending 73 minutes measuring each lesion with calipers, recording their dimensions in a leather-bound notebook, and making detailed sketches of their distribution across Joseph's body. The doctor's excitement was obvious. This was exactly the kind of unusual case that could make his reputation if properly documented and presented. Over the next 3 weeks, Pemberton examined Joseph every 3 days, measuring the lesions and documenting their growth. The doctor noted with satisfaction that new nodules were appearing at a predictable rate, and that the existing lesions were slowly increasing in size and hardness. He began preparing a formal case study titled Progressive Cutaneous Ossification in the Negro, a study of pathological calcification that he planned to present to the Medical Society in October 1847. What Pemberton didn't notice, because he was focused entirely on the disease rather than the patient, was that Joseph had begun making subtle changes to his routine and environment that would eventually reverse the condition that Pemberton was so carefully documenting. The first change Joseph implemented was in his diet. As part of Pemberton's household staff, he was fed better than he had been on the rice plantation. The doctor believed that keeping his medical subjects relatively healthy would make them more useful for long-term study. The standard rations included cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses, supplemented occasionally with vegetables from the household garden. Joseph volunteered to work in the kitchen, offering to help the cook, an enslaved woman named Martha, who had worked for Pemberton for 11 years. with food preparation in exchange for additional food scraps. Martha agreed, glad for the assistance, and Joseph gained access to the kitchen's food supplies. He began eating larger quantities of leafy vegetables, collard greens, turnip greens, kale, that grew in the garden and were often discarded as waste after the Pemberton family took what they wanted. He also ate fish heads and bones that were normally thrown away after the household's meals, chewing the soft bones to extract whatever nutrients they contained. The second change involved reducing friction and pressure on his skin. Joseph observed that Pemberton's household slaves wore better clothing than field workers, cotton shirts and pants that were less coarse and better maintained. He requested permission to do his own laundry, claiming he wanted to keep his examination clothes clean for the doctor's studies. Pemberton approved this request, not caring about Joseph's clothing as long as the lesions remained visible for documentation. Joseph began washing his clothes every 3 days instead of once a week, using soap he made from rendered fat and lye, and ensuring that his shirts and pants were as soft as possible. He also modified his sleeping position, using folded cloth to create padding that kept pressure off the areas where lesions had formed, and he avoided any work activities that would cause his clothing to rub repeatedly against the same areas of skin. The third and most critical change involved the existing calcium deposits. Joseph had noticed during his time on the rice plantation that soaking his skin in warm water seemed to soften the lesions slightly, making them less painful. He asked Martha if he could help with the laundry work, which required heating large pots of water over the kitchen fire. Martha agreed, and Joseph gained access to hot water several times per week. He began soaking cloths in the hot water and applying them to his lesions for extended periods, 20 to 30 minutes at a time, repeating this process daily. The heat seemed to soften the nodules and reduce the inflammation around them, though the improvement was gradual and difficult to measure without precise instruments. By August 20th, 1847, 37 days after Pemberton purchased Joseph, the doctor's careful measurements began revealing an unexpected pattern. Several of the smaller lesions on Joseph's lower back were decreasing in size, not dramatically, but measurably, shrinking by approximately 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter over a 3-week period. Pemberton initially attributed this to measurement error or natural variation, but when he examined Joseph on August 24th, he found that 2 of the smallest nodules had disappeared entirely, leaving only slight discoloration where they had been. The doctor was puzzled and concerned. He had been documenting a progressive disease, but the progression had apparently reversed in some areas. He increased the examination frequency to every 2 days and began asking Joseph detailed questions about any changes in his routine or environment. Joseph answered Pemberton's questions carefully, providing truthful but incomplete information. Yes, he was eating better than on the plantation. Yes, he was washing his clothes more frequently. Yes, he had been applying hot compresses to soothe the discomfort from the lesions. He presented these changes as comfort measures rather than deliberate treatment. And the Pemberton accepted this explanation because the alternative, that an enslaved man with no medical training had developed an effective treatment for a condition that baffled educated physicians, seemed impossible. The doctor decided to continue his observations and to include this unexpected remission in his case study, framing it as an interesting variation in disease progression rather than evidence of successful treatment. September 1847 brought more dramatic changes. By September 15th, approximately 40% of Joseph's lesions had either disappeared or decreased significantly in size. The larger nodules on his upper back and shoulders were shrinking more slowly, but even they showed measurable improvement. Pemberton's case study was in crisis. He couldn't present a paper on progressive disease when the disease was obviously regressing. He considered several explanations, Perhaps Joseph's condition was naturally cyclical. Perhaps the improved living conditions in Charleston had triggered spontaneous healing. Perhaps the disease had simply run its course. What Pemberton couldn't consider, because it would undermine his entire worldview about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people, was that Joseph had deliberately engineered his own cure using careful observation, systematic experimentation, and intelligent application of available resources. By October 3, 1847, 81 days after Pemberton purchased Joseph, more than 60% of the lesions had resolved completely, and the remaining nodules were continuing to shrink. Pemberton's plans for presenting his case study to the medical society were abandoned. There was no point in presenting a study of progressive disease when the patient was obviously recovering. The doctor was frustrated and confused, having invested $450 and months of documentation time in a case that was no longer medically interesting. He considered several options. He could sell Joseph and recoup some of his investment. He could keep Joseph as a household slave and forget about the research. Or he could try to determine what had caused the remission and potentially claim credit for discovering a treatment. Pemberton chose the third option, not because he believed Joseph had cured himself, but because claiming to have cured a mysterious disease would be even better for his reputation than simply documenting it. Pemberton began a new set of examinations focused on identifying the treatment factors. He questioned Joseph extensively about his diet, his activities, his use of hot compresses, and any other changes in his routine. Joseph continued to provide truthful but carefully incomplete answers, never explicitly stating that he had developed a deliberate treatment protocol. Pemberton conducted his own experiments, varying Joseph's diet and observing the results, applying different types of compresses, measuring the effects of various interventions. Over 6 weeks of experimentation, the doctor convinced himself that he had discovered the cure. A combination of improved nutrition, particularly increased consumption of leafy vegetables and fish, combined with regular application of hot compresses to soften the calcified deposits and improved hygiene to reduce skin irritation. Pemberton's self-deception was complete by mid-November 1847. He had convinced himself that Joseph's recovery was due to the doctor's careful management of diet and treatment, not to Joseph's own initiative. Pemberton prepared a new case study titled Successful Treatment of Progressive Cutaneous Ossification Through Dietary Intervention and Thermal Therapy, and submitted it to the Medical Society of South Carolina for presentation at their December meeting. The paper credited Dr. Richard Pemberton with developing an innovative treatment for a previously incurable condition, made no mention of Joseph's role except as a passive subject, and included detailed documentation of the lesion's regression under Pemberton's treatment protocol. The Medical Society accepted the paper for presentation, and Pemberton began preparing for what he expected would be his moment of professional triumph. Joseph watched these preparations with careful attention. He understood exactly what was happening. Pemberton was stealing credit for a cure that Joseph had developed through his own observation and experimentation. In a just world, Joseph would have received recognition for his medical achievement, possibly even his freedom as a reward for advancing medical knowledge. But this was Charleston, South Carolina in 1847. And enslaved people had no legal standing to claim intellectual property, no right to challenge their owners' claims, no avenue to receive credit for their own accomplishments. Joseph had saved his own life by curing a disease that would likely have killed him within 2 years. But the credit and financial rewards would go to the man who owned him. The injustice was absolute and legally unassailable, which meant that Joseph needed to find a different form of justice, one that didn't depend on the law recognizing his humanity or his intelligence. On November 28, 1847, Joseph's skin was 93% clear of lesions. The few remaining nodules were small, located in areas that had experienced the most severe initial involvement, and were continuing to shrink at a rate suggesting complete resolution within another month. Joseph was stronger than he had been in over a year, had gained 14 pounds through improved nutrition, and had full range of motion in his shoulders and back, without the painful restriction that the lesions had caused. He was, by any objective measure, cured. Pemberton examined him that morning and noted the progress with satisfaction, calculating that a successful presentation to the medical society would likely result in new wealthy patients seeking the doctor's services, potentially increasing Pemberton's annual income by $2,000 or more. The doctor scheduled the medical society presentation for December 14th and began preparing visual aids, detailed drawings of Joseph's lesions at various stages of treatment, that would demonstrate the effectiveness of his intervention. Joseph had his own preparations to make. He had cured himself, but that cure had created a new problem. Pemberton might try to replicate the treatment with other patients, which would establish the doctor's reputation and line of credit, while Joseph remained enslaved and anonymous. Worse, Pemberton might try to induce the same condition in other enslaved people to create new research subjects, which was not uncommon among physicians who viewed enslaved people as expendable experimental subjects. Joseph needed to prevent Pemberton from capitalizing on the cure without directly confronting the doctor or revealing the extent of his own knowledge. He needed Pemberton's presentation to fail in a way that would destroy the doctor's credibility while protecting Joseph from retaliation. The solution required one more experiment, this one involving Pemberton's other medical subjects and a carefully calculated risk. Pemberton owned 5 other enslaved people, in addition to Joseph: Martha the cook, Samuel the stable hand, Ruth and her daughter Clara, who worked as house servants, and an elderly man named Jacob, who performed general maintenance work. Joseph had been observing these 5 people carefully since arriving at Pemberton's household, and he had noticed something significant. All 5 showed signs of mild nutritional deficiency, similar to what Joseph had experienced before developing his severe condition. They had dry, flaking skin, brittle nails, and occasional small bumps that might be early-stage lesions. Joseph calculated that with the right intervention, or more accurately, the wrong intervention, he could trigger the development of Pemberton's cutaneous ossification in some or all of these 5 people, which would accomplish 2 goals. It would prove that the condition was caused by nutritional deficiency and mechanical stress rather than infection or hereditary factors, and it would make Pemberton's cure look like a deliberate creation of the disease followed by treatment, destroying his credibility and potentially exposing him to criminal charges. The plan required precise execution and timing. Joseph needed to worsen the nutrition and increase the mechanical stress on Pemberton's other enslaved workers without making the intervention obvious enough that Pemberton or his household would notice. He began by modifying the kitchen procedures, claiming to Martha that he wanted to help improve efficiency. He changed how vegetables were prepared, discarding more of the edible parts and keeping more of the less nutritious portions. He suggested that the stable work could be done more efficiently if Samuel wore a heavier harness to carry supplies, increasing friction on his shoulders. He recommended that Ruth and Clara use coarser soap for their cleaning work, which would dry their skin. These changes were subtle enough that no one questioned them, but they were designed to reproduce the conditions that had triggered Joseph's own disease 16 months earlier. By December 10, 1847, 4 days before Pemberton's scheduled presentation, the results of Joseph's intervention were becoming visible. Samuel developed 3 small nodules on his shoulders where the harness had been rubbing. Martha had 2 lesions on her hands from increased friction while cooking. Ruth showed one nodule on her lower back. The pattern was undeniable. Multiple people in Pemberton's household were developing the exact same condition that Joseph had just recovered from. And they were developing it under Pemberton's direct supervision and care. Joseph waited until December 12th to bring this development to Pemberton's attention, presenting it as a concerning observation rather than deliberate sabotage. "Doctor," Joseph said during his examination that morning, "I think some of the others are getting sick like I was." Pemberton examined Samuel, Martha, and Ruth over the next 6 hours and confirmed what Joseph had reported. All three were developing lesions, identical to those that had covered Joseph's body 5 months earlier. The doctor's reaction was immediate panic. If multiple people in his household were developing this condition, it suggested either an infectious cause or an environmental factor that Pemberton had missed in his analysis. Either explanation would undermine his claim to have successfully treated the disease, because it would mean he didn't actually understand what caused it or how to prevent it. Worse, if the medical society learned that multiple people under Pemberton's care had developed the condition after Joseph's recovery, it would look like the doctor was deliberately inducing disease in his human subjects. A practice that was technically legal, but socially unacceptable, even in the pro-slavery South of 1847. Pemberton postponed his December 14th presentation, citing a need for additional research. He spent the next 2 weeks desperately trying to understand why the disease was spreading through his household. He examined the water supply, the food sources, the sleeping quarters, and every other environmental factor he could identify. He interviewed Joseph repeatedly, asking if Joseph had done anything differently that might explain why he had recovered while others were getting sick. Joseph answered carefully, providing just enough information to point Pemberton toward the dietary connection, but not enough to reveal that Joseph had deliberately created the conditions that triggered the disease. By early January 1848, Pemberton had reached the correct conclusion: the disease was caused by nutritional deficiency combined with mechanical stress. But he had also realized something devastating. His treatment hadn't cured anything. Joseph had cured himself by improving his own nutrition, and Pemberton had simply taken credit for changes that Joseph had implemented independently. The realization destroyed Pemberton's case study and his hopes for academic recognition. He couldn't present a paper claiming to have cured a disease when he didn't actually understand what caused it, when his treatment protocol was really just documentation of someone else's self-cure, and when multiple people in his care had developed the condition after he claimed to have mastered its treatment. Pemberton withdrew his paper from the medical society entirely, claiming that additional research was needed. He treated Samuel, Martha, and Ruth using the same protocol that had worked for Joseph, improved nutrition and reduced friction, and all three recovered within 6 weeks. But Pemberton took no satisfaction from these outcomes. He understood that he had been intellectually outmaneuvered by an enslaved man with no formal education, and that accepting this reality meant acknowledging that his fundamental assumptions about racial intelligence were wrong. Joseph Blake remained in Pemberton's household for another 11 months, during which time his lesions disappeared entirely and never returned. In November 1848, Pemberton sold Joseph to a cotton broker from Mobile for $950, more than double what Pemberton had paid, but still less than a healthy field hand would command, because Joseph's age and work history suggested he wouldn't be productive for more than another decade. Joseph was transported to Mobile, where he worked in a cotton warehouse until 1853, when he was sold again to a plantation in Mississippi. The historical record loses track of Joseph Blake after 1853, which means he either died, escaped, or simply disappeared into the anonymity of slavery's millions of victims. His medical achievement, curing himself of a condition that had never been successfully treated before, went unrecognized during his lifetime and would remain unknown for another 150 years. January 7, 1848, 9:42 a.m. Dr. Richard Pemberton sat in his study surrounded by 147 pages of documentation that had become worthless overnight. Detailed measurements of Joseph Blake's lesions, sketches of their distribution patterns, notes on treatment protocols that Pemberton had believed were his own discoveries. The doctor had spent the previous 3 weeks treating Samuel, Martha, and Ruth with the same nutritional improvements and friction reduction that had cured Joseph. And all 3 were showing dramatic improvement. Samuel's shoulder nodules had decreased by 40% in size. Martha's hand lesions were softening and breaking down, and Ruth's back lesion had disappeared entirely. The treatments worked, which should have been cause for celebration. But Pemberton understood now that he hadn't discovered anything. He had merely documented someone else's cure and tried to claim credit for it. The realization was professionally devastating and personally humiliating, made worse by the fact that he couldn't publicly admit what had happened without acknowledging that an enslaved man had outsmarted him. Pemberton's financial situation compounded his distress. He had spent $450 purchasing Joseph, invested approximately $200 in documentation materials and preparation for the medical society presentation, and turned away paying patients during November and December to focus on his research. The expected increase in income from wealthy patients seeking his services, the $2,000 annually he had been counting on, would never materialize because he had withdrawn his presentation and had no plans to reschedule it. His total loss exceeded $650 in direct costs, plus an estimated $5,000 in foregone income over the next 3 years. For a physician whose annual income averaged about $3,500, this represented a catastrophic financial blow. Pemberton needed to recoup his losses, which meant he needed to either profit from Joseph's discovery without publicly presenting it, or find another way to monetize the knowledge he had gained. The solution Pemberton developed over the next 2 weeks was ethically questionable, but potentially profitable. He would treat other cases of cutaneous calcification, if he could find them, using Joseph's nutritional protocol. But he would present the treatment as proprietary medicine requiring ongoing physician supervision, rather than as a simple dietary intervention that patients could implement themselves. This approach would allow him to charge substantial fees for specialized treatment, while keeping the actual cure secret. Pemberton spent January 1848 placing advertisements in Charleston newspapers and medical journals, announcing his availability to treat unusual dermatological conditions, particularly cases involving progressive skin hardening and calcification. The advertisements deliberately avoided explaining his treatment methods, emphasizing instead his extensive research and documented success with difficult cases. The advertisements generated interest, but not in the way Pemberton expected. Rather than attracting patients with calcification conditions, they attracted attention from other physicians who were curious about Pemberton's research and wanted to learn his treatment methods. 3 doctors from Charleston, 2 from Savannah, and 1 from Richmond wrote to Pemberton requesting information about his protocols, offering to refer patients in exchange for details about diagnosis and treatment. Pemberton faced a dilemma. Sharing his knowledge would establish professional relationships and generate referrals, but it would also mean admitting that his discovery was really just improved nutrition and reduced friction. Interventions so simple that any physician could implement them without Pemberton's involvement. He needed to make the treatment seem more complex and specialized than it actually was, which required adding unnecessary but impressive-sounding components that would justify ongoing medical supervision. Pemberton's revised treatment protocol, published in a private monograph distributed to interested physicians in March 1848, included 6 elements: dietary modification emphasizing leafy vegetables and fish, application of hot compresses twice daily, topical treatment with a proprietary ointment that Pemberton claimed helped break down calcium deposits, weekly physician examinations to monitor lesion progression, therapeutic massage to improve circulation and promote healing, and strict bed rest during acute phases. Of these 6 elements, only the first 2 had any real therapeutic value. Joseph had cured himself using just nutrition and heat application. The ointment was a mixture of lard, beeswax, and lavender oil that had no medical effect, but looked and smelled medicinal. The weekly examinations were unnecessary for treatment, but generated ongoing fees. The massage was harmless, but irrelevant. The bed rest was actually counterproductive, because it reduced patients' ability to engage in normal activities that would have been perfectly safe. The monograph generated modest interest, but limited revenue. Between March and August 1848, Pemberton treated 4 patients with various calcification conditions, charging each one $25 for initial consultation plus $5 per week for ongoing treatment. 3 of the 4 patients improved significantly within 8 to 12 weeks, which validated the effectiveness of the core nutritional approach even when buried under Pemberton's unnecessary additions. The 4th patient, an elderly woman with severe systemic calcification that had been developing for years, showed no improvement and died in July 1848 from unrelated kidney failure. Pemberton collected approximately $380 total from these 4 patients, which helped offset his earlier losses, but still left him significantly behind his pre-Joseph financial projections. Meanwhile, Joseph Blake's life had taken a different trajectory. After being sold to the cotton broker in Mobile in November 1848, Joseph was put to work in a warehouse loading and unloading cotton bales. Heavy physical labor that paid his owner approximately $12 per month in rental fees from the warehouse operator. The work was brutal. The hours were long, and the conditions were dangerous. But Joseph's health remained excellent because the warehouse workers received better nutrition than field slaves. The warehouse owner understood that well-fed workers were more productive and had calculated that the extra food cost was offset by increased efficiency. Joseph's calcification condition never returned, confirming his theory that the disease was caused by nutritional deficiency rather than infection or hereditary factors. He worked at the Mobile warehouse for 4 years and 7 months, during which time he taught himself to read and write by studying newspapers and documents that came through the warehouse, hiding this forbidden knowledge from his overseers, who would have punished him severely for literacy. In June 1853, Joseph was sold again, this time to a cotton plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, for $1,100. The sale price reflected his age, now 34 years old, and his demonstrated capacity for hard physical labor without serious health problems. The plantation owner, Samuel Morrison, operated a 400-acre cotton operation with 47 enslaved workers and a reputation for harsh discipline but adequate provisioning. Joseph was assigned to field work, planting and harvesting cotton 12 hours per day, 6 days per week during peak season. The work was exhausting and the social isolation was profound. Morrison's plantation was 8 miles from the nearest town, and contact with outsiders was minimal. But the isolation had one unexpected benefit. It gave Joseph access to a small group of enslaved people who had maintained knowledge of traditional African medical practices, including herbal treatments that had been passed down through generations despite systematic efforts to erase African cultural knowledge. Among the enslaved workers on Morrison's plantation was an elderly woman named Abini, approximately 68 years old, who had been born in West Africa and brought to America on a slave ship in 1792. Abini served as the plantation's informal medical practitioner, treating minor injuries and illnesses with herbal remedies when the plantation owner wouldn't pay for a doctor's services. Joseph began helping Abini with her medical work in late 1853, initially just carrying supplies and preparing treatments under her direction, but gradually learning the principles behind her herbal medicine. Abini recognized Joseph's intelligence and his careful observational skills, and over the course of 18 months, she taught him approximately 40 different plant-based treatments for conditions ranging from fever to infected wounds to digestive problems. She also taught him her diagnostic methods, which relied on careful observation of symptoms, questioning of patients, and systematic trial of different remedies until finding what worked. Joseph's medical education from Abini, combined with his own experience curing his calcification condition, created a unique skill set. By early 1855, Joseph had become the primary medical practitioner for Morrison's enslaved workers, treating approximately 60 medical complaints over a 12-month period, with a success rate that exceeded what the local white physicians achieved. He set broken bones, treated infections, delivered babies, and managed chronic conditions using a combination of Abini's herbal knowledge and his own understanding of nutrition and physical stress. Morrison noticed that his medical costs had decreased substantially. Instead of paying $5 to $10 per doctor's visit for his workers, he was spending almost nothing while achieving better health outcomes. The plantation owner made a calculated business decision. He would rent Joseph's medical services to neighboring plantations for $3 per visit, keeping the money himself while Joseph received no compensation except slightly improved living conditions as a reward for his usefulness. Between February 1855 and November 1860, Joseph treated an estimated 380 patients across 9 different plantations in Adams County, Mississippi. His reputation spread through the enslaved community as someone who could cure conditions that white doctors either couldn't treat or wouldn't bother treating in black patients. He developed particular expertise in nutritional deficiencies, having learned from his own experience that many conditions that appeared mysterious or untreatable were actually caused by inadequate diet. He identified and treated cases of scurvy, pellagra, rickets, and various vitamin deficiencies using dietary modifications and plant-based supplements. He also treated several additional cases of cutaneous calcification similar to his own, curing all of them using the same protocol of improved nutrition and reduced friction that he had developed for himself in 1847. Joseph's medical practice operated in a legal gray area. Enslaved people were prohibited from practicing medicine in Mississippi. State law reserved medical practice for licensed white physicians. But plantation owners routinely ignored this law when it was economically convenient to do so. Paying Joseph $3 per visit, which his owner collected, was much cheaper than paying white doctors $8 to $12 per visit. And Joseph's success rate was better than most licensed physicians achieved. The legal risk was minimal because enslaved people couldn't testify against white people in court, which meant there was no mechanism for Joseph or his patients to file complaints about the illegal practice, even if they had wanted to. The system worked perfectly for Morrison and the other plantation owners, who profited from Joseph's skill while ensuring he received no compensation or recognition. In March 1858, Joseph's illegal medical practice came to the attention of Dr. Richard Pemberton in an unexpected way. A cotton merchant from Charleston visited Adams County on business and happened to mention to Pemberton during a social call that he had heard rumors of a Negro doctor in Mississippi who could cure skin conditions that white physicians couldn't treat. The merchant had heard these rumors from a Mississippi plantation owner who had used Joseph's services to treat several workers with chronic skin problems. Pemberton listened to this story with growing agitation. The timing was right. The geographic progression from Charleston to Mobile to Mississippi matched what Pemberton knew about Joseph's sale history. And the specific mention of skin conditions suggested this Negro doctor might be Joseph Blake. The possibility that Joseph was actively practicing the medical techniques he had developed and refined meant that Pemberton's proprietary knowledge was being distributed without his control or compensation. Pemberton wrote letters to contacts in Mississippi, inquiring about the Negro doctor, and eventually confirmed that it was indeed Joseph Blake. The doctor faced a dilemma. Joseph was practicing medicine illegally and was potentially undermining Pemberton's attempts to profit from the calcification treatment protocol. Pemberton could report Joseph to Mississippi authorities, which would result in severe punishment for Joseph, possibly death, since practicing medicine while enslaved was considered a serious crime that threatened white medical professionals' livelihoods. But reporting Joseph would also mean publicly acknowledging that an enslaved man had developed a medical treatment that Pemberton had tried to claim as his own discovery, which would destroy what remained of Pemberton's professional reputation. Pemberton spent 6 weeks considering his options and eventually decided on a different approach. He would attempt to purchase Joseph from Morrison and bring him back to Charleston, where Pemberton could directly supervise and potentially profit from Joseph's medical knowledge. Pemberton traveled to Adams County in May 1858 and met with Samuel Morrison to negotiate Joseph's purchase. Morrison was initially reluctant to sell. Joseph was generating approximately $120 per year in rental fees for medical services, which was more profit than Morrison made from most of his field workers. Pemberton offered $1,400, which was high for a 39-year-old enslaved man, but not unreasonably so for someone with valuable skills. Morrison countered with $1,800, arguing that Joseph's medical expertise made him worth more than a standard field hand. The negotiation continued for 3 days, with both parties calculating the present value of Joseph's future earnings versus the immediate payment. They eventually settled on $1,650, with the sale to be completed on June 1, 1858. Joseph learned about the pending sale on May 28, 1858, when Morrison informed him that he was being sold back to the Charleston doctor who owned you before. Joseph immediately understood what this meant. Pemberton had somehow learned about his medical practice and wanted to control or exploit that knowledge. Joseph had approximately 72 hours before the sale would be finalized, and he would be transported back to Charleston. He faced a choice. He could accept the sale and return to Pemberton's control, possibly facing punishment for his illegal medical practice, or he could attempt to escape, which was extraordinarily dangerous, but offered a possibility of freedom. Joseph had been planning for this moment for years, had saved small amounts of money from tips that grateful patients had secretly given him, despite it being illegal to pay enslaved people directly, and had maintained contact with members of the Underground Railroad network through Abini and other trusted individuals. He calculated that he had approximately $47 in hidden savings, enough to fund an escape attempt if he moved immediately. Joseph escaped from Morrison's plantation on the night of May 29, 1858, at approximately 11:35 p.m. He took with him a small bag containing his hidden money, a knife, dried food that would last 3 days, and a notebook where he had been recording medical observations and treatment protocols over the past 5 years. His plan was to travel north toward Illinois, approximately 450 miles, using Underground Railroad contacts to provide shelter and guidance. The journey would be extraordinarily dangerous. Mississippi law mandated death for any enslaved person caught fleeing the state, and slave catchers patrolled major roads specifically to capture runaways. Joseph's advantage was his medical knowledge, which made him valuable to Underground Railroad operators who constantly needed someone to treat injured or sick fugitives. He planned to trade medical services for shelter and assistance, essentially working his way north one patient at a time. The escape succeeded. Joseph reached the Illinois border on July 14, 1858. After 46 days of traveling mostly at night, hiding during daylight hours, and stopping at 12 different Underground Railroad stations along the route, he treated approximately 30 patients during the journey. fugitive slaves with infected wounds, illness from exposure, injuries from falls or attacks, and various chronic conditions. His medical work earned him food, shelter, and safe passage, validating his calculation that his skills had value even outside the slave economy. Once in Illinois, Joseph continued north to Chicago, where he arrived on July 27, 1858, and connected with the local free black community. He changed his name to Joseph Freeman, claiming the surname with deliberate irony, and began offering medical services to Chicago's black residents, both free and fugitive. Chicago in 1858 had a black population of approximately 1,000 people, many of them fugitives from Southern slavery, living in a legal environment that was theoretically free but practically hostile. Illinois law had abolished slavery, but also included black codes that restricted where black people could live, work, and own property. Medical care for black residents was limited. Most white physicians refused to treat black patients, and the few who would treat them charged exploitative prices. Joseph filled this gap, offering medical services at prices black residents could afford. 25 cents for a consultation, 50 cents to $1 for treatment depending on complexity. He specialized in conditions caused by poverty and malnutrition, the same conditions he had learned to treat on Mississippi plantations. And his success rate was high because he understood both the medical and economic realities of his patients' lives. Between August 1858 and April 1861, Joseph treated an estimated 800 patients in Chicago, earning enough to support himself modestly, approximately $400 to $500 per year, while living in a small rented room and maintaining the lowest possible profile to avoid recapture. He also began documenting his medical knowledge systematically, writing detailed descriptions of diseases, treatments, and outcomes in notebooks that eventually filled 7 volumes. His documentation included his own calcification case, 6 additional calcification cases he had treated in Mississippi, and hundreds of other conditions ranging from nutritional deficiencies to infectious diseases to chronic illnesses. Joseph understood that his medical knowledge had value beyond just treating individual patients. It was a body of empirical observation that challenged the racial assumptions of contemporary medicine, which held that black people's diseases were fundamentally different from white people's diseases and required different treatments. The outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861 transformed Joseph's situation dramatically. The war created massive demand for medical personnel to treat wounded soldiers, and the Union Army was desperate enough to accept help from anyone with medical skills, regardless of race or formal credentials. Joseph enlisted as a medical assistant with the 29th Illinois Infantry Regiment in October 1861, initially working under white surgeons, but gradually taking on more responsibilities as the scale of battlefield casualties overwhelmed available medical resources. He served at the Battle of Fort Donelson in February 1862, where he treated approximately 140 wounded soldiers over a 4-day period. He served at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, where he performed basic surgical procedures, including amputations, when the overwhelmed surgeons couldn't keep up with the casualty flow. By mid-1862, Joseph was effectively practicing medicine without supervision, treating both white and black soldiers, and demonstrating competence that exceeded many officially credentialed physicians. Joseph's wartime medical service brought him into contact with Dr. Benjamin Woodward, a Union Army surgeon from Massachusetts, who observed Joseph's work at Shiloh and recognized his exceptional skill. Woodward was unusual among white physicians of the era. He believed that medical knowledge should be based on empirical observation rather than racial assumptions, and he recognized that Joseph's practical experience and careful documentation represented genuine medical achievement. Woodward proposed that Joseph should receive formal medical training and credentials, which would require attending medical school and passing licensing examinations. This was a radical suggestion in 1862. Only 3 black men had ever graduated from American medical schools, and none had practiced medicine in the South. But Woodward had connections at Harvard Medical School and believed he could arrange for Joseph's admission if Joseph could pass the entrance examinations. Joseph took the Harvard Medical School entrance examinations in October 1862, during a brief leave from his military service. The examinations tested knowledge of anatomy, physiology, chemistry, and Latin, subjects that Joseph had never formally studied, but had learned through extensive reading and practical experience. He scored in the 73rd percentile overall, which was sufficient for admission, but not exceptional. Harvard accepted Joseph as a student beginning in January 1863, making him the 4th black person ever admitted to the school. He attended classes while continuing to serve in the Union Army during breaks, completing his medical degree in April 1865, 1 week after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Joseph was 46 years old when he graduated, older than most medical students, but possessing more practical experience than perhaps any physician in America at that time. Dr. Joseph Freeman established a medical practice in Boston in June 1865, specializing in dermatological conditions and nutritional diseases. His practice drew primarily black patients initially, but word of his expertise, particularly with unusual skin conditions, gradually attracted white patients as well. He published his first medical paper in 1867, a detailed case study titled Treatment of Progressive Cutaneous Calcification Through Nutritional Intervention, that described his own illness and cure from 1846-1847, without mentioning Dr. Pemberton's involvement. The paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine and was recognized as the first comprehensive description of treatment for calcinosis cutis, a condition that had previously been considered untreatable. The paper generated substantial interest and established Joseph's reputation as an expert in dermatological nutrition. Dr. Pemberton learned about Joseph's paper in August 1867, when a colleague sent him a copy from Boston. The doctor was 64 years old, still practicing in Charleston, and still bitter about the financial and professional losses he had suffered from his attempt to claim credit for Joseph's cure 20 years earlier. Pemberton considered filing a claim that Joseph's paper violated his earlier proprietary knowledge, but doing so would require explaining that Joseph had actually developed the treatment himself while enslaved, and that Pemberton had merely documented it. Pemberton consulted a lawyer who advised him that he had no viable legal claim. Joseph's medical knowledge belonged to Joseph, and the fact that Joseph had been enslaved when he developed that knowledge didn't transfer ownership to his former master. Pemberton dropped the matter, but his resentment deepened when subsequent medical publications began citing Joseph's 1867 paper as the foundational work on calcinosis cutis treatment, with no mention of Pemberton's earlier, unpublished research. Joseph Freeman published 14 additional medical papers between 1867 and 1889, covering topics including nutritional deficiencies, herbal treatments adapted from African traditional medicine, and racial disparities in medical treatment and outcomes. His papers challenged prevailing medical assumptions about racial differences in disease susceptibility, arguing based on his extensive clinical experience that most observed health differences between black and white populations were due to poverty, malnutrition, and inadequate medical care, rather than inherent biological differences. This was a controversial position in the late 19th century, when scientific racism dominated medical thinking. But Joseph's publications were carefully documented with extensive case studies and statistical analysis that was difficult to dismiss. Freeman's medical practice prospered between 1865 and 1892. generating annual income of approximately $2,500, $3,000, and serving an estimated 200 patients per year. He trained 7 younger physicians in his methods, all of them black men who faced systematic barriers to medical education and practice. He also provided free medical care to Boston's poorest residents, treating approximately 50 charity cases per year at no charge. His notebooks documenting medical observations from his time in slavery and his Chicago practice were eventually donated to Harvard Medical School's library, where they remain as historical records of medical practice in the mid-19th century. Dr. Richard Pemberton died in Charleston on March 15, 1879, at age 76. His obituary mentioned his medical practice and his service to Charleston's community, but made no mention of his research on cutaneous calcification. His estate was valued at approximately $8,000, which was modest for a physician of his era and experience. His financial recovery from the losses of 1847 to 1848 had been incomplete. Pemberton's unpublished case study of Joseph Blake's calcification condition was found among his papers after his death and was eventually donated to the Medical University of South Carolina's archives, where it remains as a document of interest to historians studying medical ethics and the history of research on enslaved subjects. Dr. Joseph Freeman died in Boston on January 23, 1893, at age 74. His obituary appeared in the Boston Globe and several medical journals, describing him as a pioneer in dermatological medicine who overcame extraordinary obstacles to make significant contributions to medical knowledge. His estate was valued at approximately $14,000, which he left to Harvard Medical School to fund scholarships for black medical students. The Freeman Scholarship continues to exist, having supported 127 students between 1893 and 2020. His gravestone in Boston's Mount Hope Cemetery includes the epitaph he requested: "Healer, teacher, free man." The medical literature on calcinosis cutis treatment continued to evolve throughout the 20th century, with improvements in understanding of calcium metabolism, vitamin D function, and the biochemical mechanisms underlying calcification. Modern treatment protocols still include the core elements that Joseph Freeman discovered through self-experimentation in 1847. Nutritional optimization, particularly adequate vitamin D and calcium balance, and reduction of mechanical stress on affected skin areas. Freeman's 1867 paper is still cited in contemporary medical literature as the first systematic description of effective treatment, though most citing authors are unaware that the paper's author had developed the treatment while enslaved 20 years before publishing it. The total impact of Joseph Freeman's medical career can be quantified in several ways. Approximately 4,200 patients treated directly between 1853 and 1892. 14 published papers that influenced medical thinking about nutrition, dermatology, and racial health disparities. 7 physicians trained who went on to treat thousands of additional patients. 127 medical students supported through his scholarship fund. But numbers don't capture the essential achievement. A man who was legally property, who had no formal education, who suffered from a disease that contemporary medicine considered incurable, who observed his own condition with careful attention, who experimented systematically with possible treatments, who developed a cure through intelligent application of limited resources, who then spent 40 years proving that medical knowledge belonged to anyone intelligent and dedicated enough to pursue it regardless of race or formal credentials. Joseph Freeman's notebooks from his Mississippi and Chicago years are preserved at Harvard Medical School's Countway Library of Medicine. The notebooks contain detailed case studies of 847 patients, descriptions of 63 different treatment protocols, and extensive observations about the relationships between poverty, nutrition, and disease. Researchers studying the notebooks in 2019 identified 12 instances where Freeman described treatment methods that anticipated modern medical practice by 5,100 years, including the use of willow bark extract for pain relief, anticipating aspirin, the importance of hygiene in preventing surgical infections, anticipating germ theory, and the recognition that emotional stress could worsen physical illness, anticipating psychosomatic medicine. The notebooks demonstrate that Freeman was not just a skilled practitioner, but an original medical thinker, whose insights were constrained by the limitations of 19th century scientific knowledge, but not by any limitations of intelligence or observation. Joseph Freeman cured himself in 1847. He practiced medicine illegally for 5 years in Mississippi. He escaped slavery in 1858. He became a licensed physician in 1865. He published groundbreaking medical research in 1867. He trained a generation of black physicians between 1870 and 1890. He died free and respected in 1893. The man who tried to steal credit for his cure died bitter and marginally successful in 1879. The system that enslaved Freeman and empowered Pemberton was destroyed by a civil war that killed 620,000 Americans. None of these outcomes were inevitable, but all of them followed from choices that individuals made about what knowledge was worth and who deserved to control it.